Well, greeting once again, brethren. Nearly 3 millennia ago, approximately 3,000 years ago, a woman once spoke 4 words, and for centuries that woman has been maligned. Augustine, a 4th century theologian, referred to her as the devil's accomplice. The 15th century preacher John Calvin referred to this woman as a diabolical fury. And contemporary teaching regarding this woman have not improved on either Augustine's or Calvin's views. Today, in today's environment, it's almost impossible to find a minister of any denomination who disagrees with this usual condemnation towards this woman, all due to 4 words. Some individuals compare her to Mother Eve, giving in to the temptation of the serpent and enticing her husband to follow her actions, while others refer to this woman as a Jezebel, and some refer to her as Delilah. I can think of no other woman in history of mankind who has been so harshly treated, so maligned for speaking only 4 words. Due to speaking just 4 words, as written in the King James Version, this woman has been in today's vernacular, this woman for centuries has been thrown under the bus by both preachers, teachers, and scholars alike. Daniel Darling, in an article written and published in Christianity Today, states, and I quote, "Kuyper, the modern preacher and theologian, expresses the pessimism of centuries about her. He writes, in her the last spark of a woman's love, the last remainder of feminine devotion has been completely extinguished. God made man just a little lower than the angels, but here was a woman who seems to be just a little higher than the beast." End of quote. So by now, you may be wondering, you may be asking, who exactly is this woman? Is she mentioned in the Old Testament? Is she mentioned in the New Testament? Is she mentioned in both? Well, I won't keep you in suspense any longer. This woman's name is, well, this woman probably has a name, but it's not mentioned in Scripture. A little puzzling? Just stay with me. Before reading a scripture which will identify her, including her 4 infamous words, I want to first turn to the book of Proverbs, to Proverbs chapter 31, a proverb commonly referred to as the virtuous woman or the Proverbs 31 woman, when in reality, beginning with verse 10, we find this reference to a virtuous wife, a virtuous wife. Proverbs 31, beginning with verse 10, and I'll be reading through verse 28, and I'll be reading from the New Living Translation. Once again, Proverbs chapter 31, beginning in verse 10. Who can find a virtuous and capable wife? She is more precious than rubies. Her husband can trust her, and she will greatly enrich his life. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. She finds wool and flax and busily spins it. She is like a merchant ship, bringing her food from afar. She gets up before dawn to prepare breakfast for her household and plan the day's work for her servant girls. She goes to inspect a field and buy it. With her earnings, she plants a vineyard. She is energetic and strong, a hard worker. She makes sure her dealings are profitable. Her lamp burns late into the night. Her hands are busy spinning thread, her fingers twisting fiber. She extends a helping hand to the poor and opens her arms to the needy. Verse 21, she has no fear of winter for her household, for everyone has warm clothes. She makes her own bedspreads. She dresses in fine linen and purple gowns. Her husband is well known in the city gates, where he sits with the other civic leaders. She makes belted linen garments and sashes to sell to the merchants. She is clothed with strength and dignity, and she laughs without fear of the future. When she speaks, her words are wise, and she gives instructions with kindness. She carefully watches everything in her household and suffers nothing from laziness. And in verse 28, her children stand and bless her. Her husband praises her. Now what does this proverb referencing a virtuous wife, what does this proverb have to do with the woman that we mentioned in our opening statements? Not mentioned by name, but by 4 words which have maligned her for centuries. Well, let's begin to answer this question by turning to the book of Job. To the book of Job, if you would, please, and put a marker here in Proverbs 31. We'll return to it in a few minutes. But turn to the book of Job, Job chapter 1, and we'll begin reading in verse 13. Job chapter 1, beginning with verse 13. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And the messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, when the Sabaeans raided them and took them away. Indeed, they have killed the servants with the edge of a sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Verse 16. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants, and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 bands, raided the camels, and took them away. Yes, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and suddenly a great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Now, brethren, what I want to do here is to stop here for a moment, and let's come to understand this man Job. We have to come to realize that he's just experienced the most horrific, the most dreadful, the most horrendous day that any of us could ever imagine. Let's think about this. In one day, the loss of his oxen and donkeys. In one day, the murder of his servants. In one day, destruction of his sheep by fire, which also consumed additional servants. In one day, his camel stolen by the Chaldeans, with more servants being killed. And if that weren't enough, the death of his sons and daughters. All of this, brethren, all of this in one day. How would any of us act or react on a day like this? We'd be in shock, possibly in denial. I'm sure we'd be sick to our stomachs, most likely bawling our heads off. Let's notice Job's response beginning here in verse 20. Verse 20, Job's response. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshipped. And he said, verse 21, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong. Job has had all these terrible things happen. And not just happen, brethren, but happen all in one day. And this is how he responds. In all this, Job did not sin, nor charge God with wrong. Oh, he's going into mourning immediately. We can understand that, as we see in verse 20, as any of us would do. But then he turns to the Lord, which I would hope all of us would do. Now let's take a deeper look at what has actually occurred here, and try to put this in modern terms to get a better grasp or a better understanding, if you will, of these events. Let's begin at the beginning. Job chapter 1, verse 1, if you would please. Job chapter 1, verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. And 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. Also, his possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. So what we find here is a very wealthy man. This man was the Elon Musk or the Jeff Bezos of the world at that time. But notice, he went from his billionaire status to that of bankruptcy, all in one day. Brethren, he lost it all. Everything he lost, excluding his children, were the source of his income, were the source of his revenue. And it's all gone in one day. Verse 4. And his sons would go and feast in their houses, each on his appointed day, and would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. We find here that Job had 7 sons and 3 daughters, as we read in verse 2. And as we read here in verse 4, they would get together in their own homes and have dinners at certain times. And I want us to note, brethren, if you would please, that the word appointed, as in appointed times, the word appointed does not appear in the original text. In addition, we can assume that some of them, if not all of them, they were already adults, as we find that they were living in their own homes. The following is a commentary from John Gill's exposition of the Old Testament in reference to verse 4, and I quote, "They met by appointment at certain times in their own houses, and had friendly and family entertainments in turn. For such were their feasts, not designed for intemperance, luxury, or wantonness, for then they would not have been encouraged, nor even connived at by Job, but to cherish love and affection, and maintain harmony and unity among themselves, which must have been very pleasing to their parents. For a pleasant thing it is for any, and especially for parents, to behold brethren dwelling together in unity." Still quoting here. "Besides, these feasts were kept, not in public houses, much less in houses of ill fame, but in their own houses, among themselves at certain seasons, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them, not to make a feast in their turn, but to partake in their entertainment, which, as is commonly observed, it showed humanity, kindness, tenderness, and affection in themselves towards their sisters, to invite them to take part with them in their innocent and social recreations, being very likely unmarried, or otherwise their husbands would have been invited also." End of quote. Matthew Henry's commentary of the whole Bible in reference to verse 4 reads, and I quote, "All his sons were in houses of their own, probably married, and to each of them he had given a competent portion to set up with. Those that had been olive plants round his table were removed now to their own tables. To see them thrive in their affairs, and able to feast one another, as well as to feed themselves. Good parents desire, promote, and rejoice in their children's wealth and prosperity as their own." I'm still quoting. "To see them in health, no sickness in their houses, for that would have spoiled their feasting and turned into mourning, especially to see them live in love and unity and mutual good affection, no jars, no quarrels among them, no strangeness, no shyness one to another, no straight-handedness, but, though everyone knew his own, they lived with as such freedom as if they had all things in common. It is comfortable to the hearts of parents, and commonly in the eyes of all, to see brethren thus knit together. It added to his comfort to see the brothers so kind to their sisters that they sent for them to feast with them, for they were so modest that they would not have gone if they had not been sent for. End of quote. We can assume that these adult children, we can assume that they were influenced greatly by both an involved mother and an involved father, for the children, even as adults, met together regularly to dine together. Maybe a tradition introduced early in their childhood by caring parents. But understand, everything we read in verses 2, 3, and 4 are now gone, all in one day. Job just lost everything. All 10 of his kids are dead, and most of his servants, some of which I'm sure were very close friends of his. They're all gone. Job is processing this all on the same day. I'm sure he's shell-shocked, and I'm sure that PTSD is really going to hit home at some point in terms of the full impact of what has actually taken place here. Now remember his initial response from verses 21 and 22. In all this, Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong. But brethren, the story continues. Chapter 2, verse 1. Job chapter 2, verse 1. Again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and righteous man, one who fears God and shuns evil? And still he holds fast to his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without cause." So Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin. Yes, all that a man has, he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will surely curse you to your face." Verse 6. And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand, but spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took for himself a potsherd with which to scrape himself while he sat in the midst of ashes. So, brethren, after everything we read in chapter 1, after all the horrific events of chapter 1, we find here in chapter 2, we find the Lord stating to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil?" And Satan responds, "But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will surely curse you to your face." And the Lord replies, "Behold, he is in your hand, but spare his life." So we find Satan strikes Job with boils all over his body, and Job takes a piece of pottery to scrape the oozing boils. So we need to ask, at this point in time, where's Job's head now? What's going on inside? Well, he's in the midst of PTSD for sure. And he's most likely in the midst of what is known as Sarah, the 5 stages of grieving: shock, anger, rejection, acceptance, and healing. He's somewhere between shock and anger. And as one reads through the entire book of Job, one can see his ups and downs. One can see his peaks and valleys of emotion as he moves through the grieving process. Now let's pick it up in verse 9. In verse 9, he will finally disclose who this woman is that's been maligned for centuries due to 4 words. Job chapter 2, verse 9. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die, Here we find 4 words, curse God and die. And here we find the identity of the woman, Job's wife. Now notice Job's response to her statement. Verse 10. But he said to her, you speak as one of a foolish woman speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. I've got a question, brethren. Why for centuries has Job's wife been so maligned, looked at in such a negative way? Why for centuries has she been viewed as a devil's accomplice or a diabolical fury? Hasn't anyone considered that Job's wife, that she too is grieving, that she too is most likely struggling with PTSD, and that she too is somewhere in the beginning stages of Sarah? For the remainder of this message, we're going to explore the bad rap, the mislabeling, if you will, of this woman due to 4 spoken words. And hopefully we'll see a side of this woman that maybe we just haven't seen before. The title of today's sermon, 4 words do not make a person. 4 words do not make a person. Now let's stop here and put ourselves in Job's wife's shoes. What do we know about her? Well, to be frank, not much. But to create an oxymoron, we know a great deal. We know that she's Job's wife. We know that she was the mother of 10 children, and we assume that she gave birth to all 10. We understand that she was the matriarch of a very, very wealthy family. So based on this minimal knowledge of her, let's look at her 4 words in context of what's been transpiring before she spoke these 4 infamous words. But first, we ask a couple questions. Now, the book of Job was written with a focus on whom? Well, of course, it was written with a focus on Job. The whole subject of the story is how things affected him, how he handled these horrific events. But now Job's wife shows up, and we have to ask, as many in the past have not asked, we have to ask, how did she handle these things? So she's living in the same household as Job when he loses all of his wealth, when he loses all of his possessions and goes from a billionaire to bankruptcy, all in one day. We have to realize that these events happened to her as well. Her entire way of life, along with Job's, was turned upside down, all in one day. As did Job, she too had relationships and friendships with all those servants who died. And most importantly, she's a mom who lost 10 children in one day. These were the kids that she gave birth to. These were the children that she nursed. These were the children whose diapers she changed. Children she played with. Children she educated. Children she cared for when they had runny noses, scraped knees. She's the mother who intervened and healed sibling arguments, a very involved mother in her children's lives. Now, I've never been a mom, but I believe, and generally speaking, moms tend to have a stronger emotional attachment to children than dads. And why? For the reasons just stated, her emotional connection with her children. Generally speaking, I would say that it's more devastating for a mom to lose 10 children than it is for a dad to lose 10 children. And I'm not trying to minimize the loss of any child to a dad. I just think the emotional connection leans more towards the mother. So, when Job's wife makes this comment, curse God and die, we have to understand that she too is experiencing Job's trials. The only trial she's missing is that of the boils. But I want us to consider this additional factor, that Job's wife had to face. She now has a husband with a health problem, a husband who is incapacitated, a husband who is unable to care for himself. She immediately becomes a caregiver. You know, looking back on my life, I remember when my mom became a caregiver for my dad with his multiple myeloma cancer. For 5 years, my mother spent countless hours attending to his needs, 5 years of putting her needs on hold. And I can tell you, brethren, firsthand, I saw my mother's own health deteriorate as she tended to my father's needs. Job's wife, well, under the influence of PTSD, she too is working through Sarah. And what's the second stage of grief? It's anger. With her 4 words, she's lashing out. She's seeking to blame someone for all that she's going through, for that individual who's created her anger. Well, we all know the answer to that. It's Satan. Early on in this message, we read about the virtuous wife. Well, have you ever overlaid Proverbs 31 to what little we know about Job's wife? I want to take a few minutes and do a comparison. I think you'll be surprised. Back to Proverbs 31, if you would, please. Back to Proverbs 31. We're going to do a comparison and overlay, as I referred to it, beginning with verse 10. Who can find a virtuous and capable wife? She is more precious than rubies. Well, was not Job so pleased with his wife that together they raised 10 children? In raising these children, did not the majority of that raising fall in the capable hands of this precious ruby, the capable hands of Job's wife, as he went about building the family empire? Verse 11. Her husband can trust her, and she will greatly enrich his life. Well, much trust was given to Job's wife as she went about her everyday chores of cooking, cleaning, raising the children, most likely educating the 10 children. And as adults, educated by their mother, we can assume that the boys greatly enriched Job's running of his business, as they most likely participated in it. Verse 12. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. Care, comfort, companionship, communication, even children, all provided by Job's wife, all good and vitally important aspects of any marriage. Verse 13, she finds wool and flax and busily spins it. We can assume that she herself, or through direction to her servants, spun the wool from their 7,000 sheep. Verse 14, she is like a merchant ship, bringing her food from afar. Well, camels were in use for what in the Middle East? They were and are used to transport goods. We can assume that Job's wife was instrumental in identifying which foodstuffs or other goods she would need imported on a regular basis, utilizing their 3,000 camels to do the transportation of these goods and these foodstuffs from afar off. Verse 15. She gets up before dawn to prepare breakfast for her household and plan the day's work with her servant girls. Well, Job's wife, with a husband and 10 children, as well as countless servants, I don't think any additional comments need to be made here. She certainly was up before dawn. Verses 17, 18, and 19 do not need any additional comment, as Job's wife is certainly an energetic. She's certainly a strong. She's certainly hard and a busy worker. Verse 21, she has no fear of winter for her household, for everyone has warm clothes. Well, again, having access to the wool of 7,000 sheep, we can assume Job and his children were attired properly for all seasons. Verse 22, She makes her own bedspread. She dresses in fine linen and purple gowns. This family, being as wealthy as they were, assuredly Job's wife dressed in fine linens. Verse 23, her husband is well known in the city gates, where he sits with the other civic leaders. Being a billionaire of the day, we can consider that Job was a prominent figure among the civic leaders. Now verse 25, reading from the Bible in basic English. Verse 25, strength and self-respect are her clothing. She is facing the future with a smile. Well, brethren, there is emotional strength in the knowledge that she raised 10 children into adulthood. And with that comes dignity, and with that comes self-respect of motherhood. After the trial was over, she faced the future with a smile as the Lord blessed the family with doubling their wealth. Verse 26, when she speaks, her words are wise, and she gives instruction with kindness. Having educated and trained 10 children into adulthood, she surely gave wise instruction as to what to expect in life. Verse 27, she carefully watches everything in her household and suffers nothing from laziness. Well, I'm sure laziness was not even considered. I'm sure laziness was not even in her vocabulary, knowing the needs of a husband and 10 children. Verse 28, the first part, her children stand and bless her. Well, staying close to home as adults, these children stood by her, and I'm sure were a blessing to her. The remainder of verse 28, her husband praises her. From what we read in verse 10 of Job chapter 2, we can see that Job did in fact praise her. Turn back, if you would please, to Job, to chapter 2, and we'll read verse 10. Job chapter 2, verse 10, but he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Well, regarding this verse, verse 10, we find this quote from Daniel Darling, an article published in Christianity Today. Mr. Darling writes, and I quote, Job's response is fascinating. He carefully listens and watches his beloved wife shrink under the weight of their hardship together. I imagine Job lifts his blistered hands and strokes her hair. At first, her words read like a harsh rebuke. You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? Yet, if you listen to Job, you almost hear admiration. You speak as one of the foolish women. He didn't say his wife was a foolish woman. He didn't even say her words were foolish. He said she sounds like one of the foolish women. In other words, you don't sound like yourself. You might read these words like this, like, sweetheart, that's not like you talking. This doesn't sound like the woman of God that I know and married. That is not you talking, my wife. Let's remember God's promises. Let's remember His goodness. Such a far cry from ringing condemnation she's received in centuries since. Job knew his wife's suffering was just as acute as his. In fact, seeing the pain of her eyes may have added to Job's great suffering. And I'm still quoting here from Daniel Darling. It's likely she was in the state of shock. Sudden loss has a way of clouding our judgment, distorting our view of reality and of God. Often those living in the thick of tragedy make contradictory statements about faith and life. Today we might even conclude Job's wife suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. Apparently Job's words were the balm his wife needed to soothe her soul, because she isn't heard from again in the remaining chapters of the story. End of quote. When comparing Job's wife to that of Proverbs 31, Is it fair to state that she was a poster child of a virtuous wife? Well, we really can't say. But one thing for sure, Job's wife certainly possessed many, if not all, of the attributes of a virtuous wife. At this point, brethren, I think it's fair to ask another question. Did God ever rebuke Job's wife? Well, it's interesting that religious leaders for centuries have maligned Job's wife, yet God did not. I cannot find any condemnation of Job's wife from God. One would think that if God was displeased with her, he would have stated so. Turn please to Job chapter 42. Job chapter 42, and we'll read verses 7 through 9. Job chapter 42, beginning with verse 7, we read, "And so it was, after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, that the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, 'My wrath is aroused against you and your two friends, for you have not spoken to me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now therefore, take for yourselves 7 bulls and 7 rams, go to my servant Job, and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering. And my servant Job shall pray for you, for I will accept him, lest I deal with you according to your folly, because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has.' So Eliphaz the Temanite, and Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite went and did as the Lord commanded them." We find here, brethren, in these 3 verses, we find here that God did not hesitate to rebuke Job's friends. Yet, we find no rebuke of Job's wife. What we do find is how God blessed her after Job's trial was over. Continuing in verse 10 through 16, Job 42, verse 10, "And the Lord restored Job's losses when he prayed for his friends. Indeed, the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Job's wife shared in the doubling of their wealth." Verse 11, "Then all his brothers and all his sisters and all those who had been his acquaintances before came to him and ate food with him in his house. And they consoled him and comforted him with all the adversity that the Lord had brought upon him. Each one gave him a piece of silver and each a ring of gold." Well, again, Job's wife shared in these wonderful get-togethers. Verse 12, "Now the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning, for he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoken of ox, and 1,000 female donkeys." Job's wife was blessed to share in God's restoration of the family resources. Beginning here in verse 13, "He also had 7 sons and 3 children. And he called the name of his first Jemimah, the name of the second Keziah, and the name of the third Karen Happuch. In all the land," verse 15, "were found no woman so beautiful as the daughters of Job, and their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers." Job's wife had the privilege to giving birth to 10 more children. Verse 16, "After this, Job lived 140 years and saw his children and grandchildren for 4 generations. It's very likely, brethren, that Job's wife shared in many more fruitful years of her husband's life. So what if any lesson or lessons can we learn from Job's wife? Well, brethren, we're going to look at 3. I'm sure we can come up with more, but at this point I just want to look at 3 lessons that we can learn from Job's wife. Lesson number 1, compassion. Compassion. Many of us seem to take the easy route, and by that I mean that it's easy to give comfort and encouragement after the fact. But how many of us show compassion, real compassion, during one's trials? Once again, Job chapter 42, and in verse 11 we read, "Then all his brothers and all his sisters and all those who had been in his acquaintances before came to him and ate food with him in his house. And they consoled him and comforted him for all the adversity that the Lord had brought upon him." As was stated just a moment ago, it's easy to give comfort and encouragement after the fact. That's what we read here in verse 11. Oh, it was nice, don't get me wrong. It was nice to have siblings and friends to join Job and to rejoice with Job now that the trial was over. But who was with Job during the deepest valley of his trial? During the deepest valley of his life? During the time in which he wished he was never born? Well, Scripture doesn't state how long Job's trial lasted, but in chapter 7, verse 3 we read, "So I've been allotted months of futility, and wearisome nights have been appointed to me." Well, the indication here from verse 3 is the trial lasted possibly for months. Yet understand this, brethren, yet every day of every week of every month of that trial, Job's wife was by his side, caring, loving, and yes, enduring this trial allowed by God. Caregiving of itself is compassion. Her caregiving of itself is the hesed of God in action, which leads us to lesson number 2, endurance. Endurance. Lesson number 2 starts off with a few questions. Was Job's wife's attitude right each day of each week of each month? Probably not. Did she have endless nights of looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next shoe to drop? Most likely. Was she frustrated at all? Well, I'm sure she was. Did she say things she would later regret? Sure she did. We find an example of that from her infamous 4 words. She's proof that you can't unring the bell. There's no denying that she said what she said. Once you push that send button, it's very difficult to recall that email. She said things that I'm sure she regretted. But one thing we must come to understand. We must come to understand that Job was not alone in this trial, for she too was enduring the loss of livestock, enduring the loss of servants, enduring the loss of family, and not just a family member, not just a child, but children. She too was mourning the loss of 10 children. But you know, she hung in there. Through it all, she endured. Turn please to the New Testament, to the Epistle of James, to James chapter 5. And we'll begin reading with verse 10. The Epistle of James, chapter 5. We'll begin reading with verse 10. Verse 10 of James chapter 5. For examples of patience in suffering, dear brothers and sisters, look at the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Verse 11, James chapter 5. We give great honor to those who endure under suffering. For instance, you know about Job, a man of great endurance. You can see how the Lord was kind to him in the end, for the Lord is full of tenderness and mercy. There's that hesed again. Well, brethren, we often hear of the patience of Job, here stated as endurance. But Job's wife needs to be credited with endurance as well. For she too, in the end, experienced the kindness of the Lord. She too experienced the full tenderness, the full mercy, the full hesed of the Lord. You know, what Job and his wife went through would have split up most marriages. But they endured. They endured together. And we read of these two being blessed by God through the raising of another 10 children. The Hesed brethren of God. Lesson number 3, character. Character. I personally feel that this third lesson, and probably the most important lesson we can learn from Job's wife, besides that of compassion and endurance, is that she was a true representative of Christian character. Turn please to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We'll read verse 58. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We'll read verse 58. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. Job's wife was steadfast. She was immovable in her relationship with her husband, knowing that her support of him would not be in vain. Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2, we'll read verses 3 and 4. Philippians chapter 2, verse 3. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. Verse 4 of Philippians chapter 2, let each of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others. Job's wife showed humility, an attribute of Christian character. She went about looking after the interests of her husband rather than her own interest. And remember, she too was grieving. 1 Peter, if you would please, 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 5. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5. Likewise, you younger people, submit yourselves to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility. For God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Verse 6 of 1 Peter chapter 5, therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. We find Job's wife showing forth Christian character of humility, in setting aside her own needs, in practicing true love, outgoing concern for her husband, caring for the needs of her husband. And in doing so, she too was exalted by the mighty hand of God. In conclusion, I want to state that some of what has been presented here today is conjecture on my part. But I hope that this message gives each of us much more to consider, not only in understanding Job's wife, but much more to consider when making a decision about someone based on someone's words, especially words spoken in the midst of a horrible trial. For you see, brethren, 4 words does not make a person, but Christian character does.